So it's coming up to that time of year again, and Christmas is right around the corner. And because I'm such a thoughtful, loving husband, and not because I'm tight, this year I decided I was going to make my wife a present. So there's always a little bit of a debate going on at our house at the weekends, and that's whether we should watch Star Wars or Harry Potter. And if you've ever watched any of my other videos, you've probably figured out by now that I'm the Star Wars fan. So she's the Potterhead. And what Harry Potter fan wouldn't want their own miniature Hogwarts castle? Especially one that's been modelled in the snow. I mean, I know I would. It's not quite a Death Star, but I'd take it. But putting the ongoing fandom debates to one side, the first thing I was going to need to do was figure out how I was going to make the castle. And because I haven't got the time, skill or patience to build the castle from scratch, I decided to head over to my mini factory, where I found this awesome 3D printable file. There's a ton of detail packed into this little model, so I highly recommend you go and check it out. I'll leave a link down in the description for anyone who's interested. But there was one more thing I needed to do before getting the castle printed, and that was to chop it up into a few bits because my print is a little bit on the small side. But this job wasn't overly complicated. After I'd downloaded the file, I just imported it into Mesh Mixer. Then it was just a case of selecting a place on the file where there wasn't too much detail going on and using the cutting tool to separate it into two pieces. Then after saving each piece as a separate file, I could go ahead and open them in the slicing software and get them supported, ready for printing. I probably could have avoided having to print this in two separate parts if I'd tilted it and used the height from the printer, but I only really wanted the support material to be underneath the model. I didn't want any on the castle, just to save the detail. Then it was just a case of letting the printer do the work. And then about 6 hours later, once everything had printed, I could remove all the support material and get the prints ready for curing. I did run into a little bit of a problem during curing because the prints decided they wanted to warp a little bit. To get around this, I probably could have cured them with the support still in place, but you live and learn. There was an easy way around this though. I just used my heat gun to soften up the prints and glued them together while they were still cooling down. Then once I removed the friendly little reminders that you should always wear gloves, I could then start working on the base. And this time round, I decided to build the base out of 30mm XPS foam. So after I'd cut my square of foam into an even smaller square of foam, I could then decide on the positioning and the framing of the castle. And this is when I decided I wanted a little bit more elevation around the rocks. So when it came to modelling the lake around Hogwarts, I could have a little bit more depth. So I sketched out the shape of the rocks onto a piece of foam core, and then I used the hot wire cutter to remove all the material and cut the foam into shape. Then it was just a case of locking that all into place with some hot glue before building up the rest of the landscape with some offcuts of foam. I didn't really want to make this step too overly complicated, so I just kept adding, cutting and removing pieces of foam until I had some nice features that I thought suited the landscape quite well. This also included building up some of those rocky outcrops that would extend out into the lake. And because there aren't many very straight lines in nature, I then used the hot wire foam cutter and my little butane torch to create some undulations in the lake bed. And this kind of goes without saying, but if you're ever going to be melting any form of foam, make sure you do it in a well ventilated area, or at the very least make sure you wear a mask, because those fumes ain't so good for you. But once I was happy with how all the landforms were starting to look, I could then move on to fitting a fascia around the sides just to tidy everything up a little bit. And this time around, I decided to try something a little bit different. I normally like to use polypropylene sheet to create my fascias, but I did wonder if I could achieve the same effect using some construction card and matte Mod Podge. And as it happens, it didn't work quite as well as I thought. I mean, it did the job, but it didn't quite give me the finish I wanted, so maybe we'll change that down the line. But for now, it was on to the next step, and that was to fill some of the gaps in the landforms and create some smoother transitions using some Das air drying clay. This stuff is a great alternative to something like Milliput, which can get quite expensive. It carves really well, and it's really quite easy to manipulate with a little bit of water, and you can get the shapes that you're after. But it does take at least 24 hours to dry solidly, so that might be something you need to keep in mind. I used the clay to fill the majority of the gaps in the foam and create some smoother transitions. I even used it to create a few features, like a pathway at the bottom which I'm going to say leads to the Forbidden Forest, as well as a small waterfall at the back of the castle, and some more rocky outcrops in and around the bottom of the lake bed. This then got put to one side to dry overnight, and the next day, when everything was nice and solid, I could then start working on the next feature, which was the texture. So it was then on to mixing up a texture paste, also known as boilie butter. Although this mixture of plaster, matte Mod Podge and paint, in spite of its name, does look delicious, I highly recommend that you don't eat it. And I know Boilie himself has the same thoughts on this, but if you want to see any more videos involving this awesome technique, go and check out his channel. But once I had the paste into a nice brushable consistency, it was just a case of slapping it all over the landscape, just to give everything a nice uniform texture. I even applied the paste to all four sides of the diorama, and as it dried, I used my finger to smooth it all out. And after a few hours of drying time, I could then start to apply the rest of the texture. I just used a few dabs of matte Mod Podge to hold in place some stones and pebbles, and some extra fine sieved dirt from my garden. And once I was happy, this all got locked into place with some isopropyl alcohol and a few drops of scenic cement. And if you didn't already know, Hogwarts is surrounded by trees, lots of trees, so I needed to model some. And after a little bit of head scratching, I found that one way of doing this was to use pipe cleaners. I picked up these pipe cleaners in my local arts and crafts store, in the hopes that with a little trimming and cutting, they might make for some convincing pine trees. And as it turns out, it actually worked quite well. If I'm completely honest, probably worked a little better than I thought they would. And after about 45 minutes of pruning, I was left with a whole bunch of these little trees that were ready to stick to the landscape. And this was a pretty easy process. I just dipped each base into a little bit of matte Mod Podge and stuck them all over the terrain in random patches. Then I added in some more trees with some fine leaf foliage just to create a little bit more variety. And at this point, because old habits die hard, I went back and decided to use some polypropylene for the fascia. Obviously this wasn't essential, but I just like that nice smooth finish. So that was all the building work finished. So this piece was finally ready for some paint, and the first thing I needed to do was get everything primed with a Zenithal highlight. And with that first step out of the way, I could get into the bulk of the painting. And lucky enough for me, I was sent a care package that might make that job a little bit easier. When the guys over at Neo Eco approached me about testing out one of their airbrushes, I thought it wasn't a bad idea. Maybe it'd make for a little bit of a change of pace. They have, however, sent me this airbrush for free, so this is just going to be my honest opinion. Having said that, I don't claim to be any sort of airbrush guru, but I'm sure I can make use of it. The first thing I noticed is that it's packaged really nicely, and it's full with lots of useful bits and pieces that's going to make life a lot easier. This kit in particular comes with 3 different needle sizes and a couple of larger cups if you want a bit more coverage. But the thing I was most impressed with so far was this little cleaning kit. It comes with this little cleaning tool specifically designed to clean out the chamber, which I think is going to be pretty useful. And it comes with some clear and to the point instructions, with step-by-step guides on how to build, use and clean your airbrush, which is going to be perfect for anybody just starting out. But there was only really one way to see if this airbrush was any good, and that was to load it up with paint and start laying down some colour. I decided to go for a nice sandstone colour for the first layer of paint on the castle. I thinned down a little bit of Hombrol acrylic paint, just enough so it'd run through the airbrush nice and smoothly, but it would still give me a good coverage. Then I just tested that I had my compressor at the right PSI, so I was getting a nice airflow for the coverage that I was after. Then I adjusted the needle travel restrictor at the back of the brush to an appropriate setting for what I was doing. Basically what this does is limit how far back I can pull the trigger, in turn limiting the amount of paint flow. And you can fine tune this even further with the airflow valve that sits underneath the cup. And with all those settings dialed in, I could start laying down some paint. And as expected, this airbrush performed quite well. It gave me a nice even coverage across all of the face of the castle. I did have a little bit of spidering here and there, but with this close-up work and having the air pressure down quite low, it was kinda to be expected, and it wasn't bad enough that it was anything I couldn't deal with. So once I had that first base coat down, I could then go on to a quick colour change to start painting the turrets and the roofs. And this is where I stumbled across one small problem that I had with this airbrush. Because of that nifty little air pressure valve at the bottom of the cup, it didn't want to sit in my airbrush holder very well. I guess you could say at this point I was being a little bit picky, but I wouldn't sacrifice having the valve there just so it'd fit in my airbrush holder. It's just something I thought was worth pointing out because it does make unloading the paint a little bit awkward. Well, for me in my airbrush holder anyway. But once I eventually got the cup cleaned out, I then moved on to using some engine grey from Vallejo's Model Air range. This paint's great to use because it's designed to go through the airbrush without the need to thin it. So hopefully this isn't going to cause any problems when applying the paint. So once I got all the settings dialed in again, I then set about blocking out all of the rooftops with a nice uniform base coat. Then when I finally felt like I was just about getting to grips with how this airbrush performed, I thought it'd be a nice idea to try and see how it handled a wash. So I thinned down some of GW's Agrax Earthshade, got that into the cup, and then started to adjust the airflow till I had some coverage that I was happy with. And I don't mind not using a traditional brush for this step, because the wash is going to act more like a glaze, so this is going to give me a nice uniform tint across all of the sandstone. And again, without any major problems, the airbrush did exactly what I asked it to do. It gave me a nice even coverage of the glaze across the whole face of the castle, with a nice even consistent flow of paint. But then it was time to put the airbrush aside for a while and get back to some brush work. I started by adding some highlights by dry brushing on some of the original sandstone colour. Then this all got tied together with a few different washes. I used some sepia on all of the sandstone and a teal blue on all of the rooftops. And with the majority of the castle painted, I could then start work on the terrain. I started by painting all of the rock faces with a dark grey wash, and then followed this up by blending in a few brown tones. It always looks a little bit dramatic at this stage, but once all the washes blend together and dry, you get a really nice effect. Then just to blend all those tones together a little bit more, I applied a fairly watered down black wash. Then the rest of the terrain received the base coat with some dark earth, before following that up with a dark brown wash just to fill in all those recesses. The next step was to spill a brown sand wash all over my cutting mat. And once I was happy that it had all been cleaned up, I then started painting the trees. This step did take a little while because there was quite a few trees, but it was nothing a podcast couldn't make go a little bit quicker. Then once my wrists had recovered from all of those funky angles, I gave the rest of the trees a coat with some burnt umber. And the last part of the terrain to be painted was the lake bed. And obviously after having watched the movies quite a few times thanks to my wife, my instincts were telling me I should be painting it green. But after looking at a lot of pictures of Hogwarts in the snow, and I mean a lot of pictures, it turns out it should probably be blue. So after mixing up a blue tone with a little bit of grey, I applied it all to the lake bed, gradually lightening up the mix with some white to try and create a smooth transition around the shoreline. Then I blended this all even further by adding some highlights with a dry brush. And once all that paint had a little time to dry, I was finally ready to start working on the water effects. But there was one more thing I wanted to add before I started to pour my resin. And that was this not so giant 3D printed giant squid. Because what Hogwarts diorama wouldn't be complete without some sort of mythical beast? And according to the Harry Potter wiki page, the giant squid was a magical beast that lived in the Great Lake on the grounds of Hogwarts Castle. Despite the generalised fear of it and one chocolate frog card describing it as the bane of Hogwarts, the giant squid was actually semi-domesticated. It was very docile and actually sometimes quite helpful to the students of Hogwarts. The squid was also known to have played with the students, such as when Fred Weasley, George Weasley and Lee Jordan tickled its tentacles as it was lying partway out of the lake. And to have accepted food from students, such as when it received toast from Harry Potter. The squid had also been seen as being either red or purple in colour. However, since the squid in the wild can change their colour, it is entirely possible that the giant squid was also able to change colours and even patterns at will. So now that the giant squid was set to be a permanent resident in the diorama, it was time to prep for a resin pour. I used a few pieces of acrylic that got hot glued in place to create a barrier. Then I used some UV resin to make sure I had a good seal. And once I made sure that had all cured properly, I could then move on to mixing up a batch of resin for the main pour. The resin was mixed in a usual way as per the instructions to a 1:1 ratio. Then I added in a couple of drops of blue pigment to give the water that icy cold look. And after 10 minutes or so, after the resin had had a chance to degas, it was ready to pour. Then I just kept an eye on it for about half an hour or so, popping any bubbles that rose to the surface. And 24 hours later, it was time to remove the acrylic. And once I'd trimmed back all of the edges of the resin, I could then go about giving all the waterways and waterfalls the UV resin treatment. Then it was on to add in some ripples to the surface of the water with some gloss Mod Podge. And once all the Mod Podge had dried thoroughly, I was left with this really nice ripple effect. Then it was on to the effect that I'd been dreading the most, and that was the snow. I've modelled a few snowy scenes in the past, but never at this scale. So to say I was nervous was a little bit of an understatement. But like everything, the more you overthink it, the more you're going to start second guessing what usually makes sense. And at this point, what made sense to me was to give everything a pretty heavy dry brush with some white acrylic. And because everything on here is at such a small scale, this first layer of paint should be just about enough to make for some fairly convincing snow that's just settled on top of the high points. And to make it a little bit easier to get to some of those hard to reach spots, I used the airbrush. And my thoughts on this airbrush from Neo Eco are actually pretty positive. All in all, this airbrush has performed really solidly. I mean, I haven't put it through any really serious testing, but it's done everything I've asked it to do without too many hiccups. And considering it retails for a little over £30, I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's just starting out. But don't just take my word for it, because there are lots of in-depth reviews on this airbrush online. But if you want to check it out for yourselves, I'll leave a link down in the description. And if I had to summarise in one sentence, I'd say, it's pretty good. But to get back to the snow effects, it was now time to add a blue wash, just to enhance some of the rock faces and give them a more icy cold look. I just mixed up some turquoise acrylic ink with some water, and applied it to a lot of the paths and exposed rock faces. There aren't any binding agents in this, so unlike a traditional wash, by the time this is dried, it should give us quite a nice subtle effect. And then before adding my snow texture, I just needed to mask off a few areas, in particular the water. Because unless it's frozen, the snow's not actually going to settle on top of the water. And speaking of snow texture, I'm going to try something a little different. There's all sorts of different snow products on the market, but nothing that really was going to give me the final look that I needed. So I thought I'd try some baby powder. I've seen people use this on other projects before, and it does give quite a convincing look. And it's pretty easy to do. I'm going to be using the classic stocking over a cup technique, courtesy of Luke Towan. This is a great way of applying a fine dirt texture to most dioramas, so why wouldn't it work with snow? The baby powder was just going to need something to stick to, so I hit everything with a very light dusting with some matte craft sealer. Then I just sprinkled over my snow. Then I just dusted off any areas where the baby powder had built up a little too much, and then locked it all into place with some more craft sealer. And once all the craft sealer was dry, I used the airbrush to apply some gloss varnish over the top of the majority of the snow. This was a nice easy way just to give all of the snow a little bit of a shine. And the very last job on the list was to frame the piece by tidying up all the sides with some black gesso. But before this little diorama got wrapped up ready for Christmas, I think there was just about enough time for a few glamour shots. So that was Hogwarts in the snow, and I just want to take a minute to thank each and every one of you for watching. The fact that you all keep watching these videos is the only reason I keep making them, and I have a lot of fun doing it, so thank you for all your continued support. But that's all from me this year, so I hope you all have a fantastic Christmas, and I'll catch you all in 2024.